At some point after 60, something quiet happens to certain men. There's no argument, no dramatic fallout, no final conversation. They don't slam doors or make speeches. They simply stop showing up. One day they're the guy who always answers the phone, always helps out, always listens. And then one day, they're gone. No explanation. Just silence. If you've ever been on the receiving end of that, it can feel confusing, even painful. And if you are that man, it can feel strangely calm, almost inevitable. What most people don't realize is that this kind of withdrawal is rarely sudden. It's not a tantrum. It's not immaturity. And in most cases, it's not bitterness. It's the final step of a psychological journey that began decades earlier. By the time a man reaches his 60s, he has usually lived several emotional lifetimes. He has worked under pressure for years, often carrying responsibility without much room to fail. Many have been married, divorced, remarried, or emotionally disconnected while still sharing a household. They've navigated family conflict, betrayal, disappointment, and long stretches of being needed but not truly known. These experiences don't disappear. They accumulate quietly. When men are younger, many still believe that effort fixes everything. If something isn't working, you talk it through. You compromise. You try harder. You explain yourself again. There's an underlying belief that if you just stay patient and do the right thing, things will eventually even out. But over time, repeated patterns begin to chip away at that belief. By 60, many men stop negotiating with life. Not out of anger, but out of fatigue. They stop explaining because they've already explained too many times. They stop asking because they've learned that asking doesn't always lead to being heard. And instead of confronting or arguing, they withdraw. One of the strongest psychological drivers behind this withdrawal is emotional exhaustion. This kind of exhaustion isn't about being tired in the physical sense. It's deeper than that. It's the fatigue that comes from decades of being expected to be strong, reliable, and emotionally steady, regardless of what's happening inside. Many men grew up in a culture that rewarded silence and endurance. You show up. You do your job. You don't complain. You carry the weight. Over the years, that role takes a toll. A man might realize that while he was always there for others, his own emotional needs were rarely prioritized. He was valued for what he provided, not for how he felt. And even when he did try to express himself, it may have been minimized or brushed aside. After enough of that, something changes. I once spoke with a retired engineer from Ohio, let's call him Michael. He spent 40 years solving complex problems for a living. At work, people depended on him. At home, he was the stable one, the mediator, the provider. When he retired in his early 60s, people assumed he'd finally relax and enjoy life. Instead, he slowly began pulling away from social gatherings, extended family, even long-standing friendships. When I asked him why, he didn't mention any single conflict. He said something much simpler. He said he felt emotionally spent. Not angry. Not depressed. Just done. He felt like he had already given enough explanations, compromises, and second chances for one lifetime. Walking away wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about protecting what little emotional energy he had left. Another major shift that happens around this age is the loss of illusion. Younger men often believe relationships are built on fairness, loyalty, and mutual effort. They assume that if something feels off, it's temporary. Older men, however, have lived long enough to see the same patterns repeat with different people. They begin to recognize manipulation faster. They notice subtle disrespect earlier. They sense emotional games almost immediately. And once the illusion that trying harder will fix it disappears, tolerance drops sharply. From the outside, the cutoff can look abrupt. But for the man himself, it's usually the result of many quiet calculations made over time. There's often a moment when he realizes he's been adjusting himself for years while the other side hasn't adjusted at all. That realization doesn't explode. It settles. And once it settles, it changes how he engages with people. Around 60, many men also experience a powerful identity shift. For most of their lives, their sense of worth has been tied to roles. Being a good husband, a good father, a reliable employee. a dependable partner. These roles shape daily decisions and behavior. But as those roles fade or lose their urgency, something else takes their place. Many men begin defining themselves by peace, not happiness, not excitement. And peace has a ruthless standard. Anything that consistently disrupts it, constant criticism, emotional instability, entitlement, or disrespect, gets removed. Quietly. Without debate. Without drama. This isn't coldness. It's clarity. When a man has spent decades managing conflict, he eventually learns that not every battle is worth fighting. Some are better avoided entirely. Distance becomes a tool, not a weapon. For men who have gone through divorce or long periods of emotional neglect, this distancing can also feel like reclaiming control. For much of their lives, they may have felt controlled by expectations, obligations, or guilt. They did what they were supposed to do. They stayed when it was uncomfortable. They tolerated things they didn't have language for at the time. After 60, time feels different. Each year feels more finite. The idea of spending limited time around people who drain energy or create stress becomes unacceptable. Psychologically, as people age, their tolerance for emotional cost decreases, while their desire for emotional clarity increases. Many senior men simply act on this shift more decisively. There's also an uncomfortable realization that emerges for some men later in life. They begin to see that certain relationships were built largely on what they provided: money, stability, problem-solving, emotional labor. When they stop offering those things at the same level, or when they finally set boundaries, the dynamic changes. Appreciation fades. Demands remain. And older men notice this quickly. Unlike younger men, they don't argue about it. They don't try to renegotiate the terms. They walk away. Accumulated resentment plays a role here too. Many senior men carry resentment silently for years. They don't vent. They don't explode. They observe. They remember. They keep an internal ledger, even if they never speak it out loud. When that emotional balance finally feels beyond repair, the withdrawal is total. From the outside, it can look cold. Psychologically, it often feels like relief. This is where many people misunderstand what's happening. They assume the man is depressed, antisocial, or emotionally damaged. But many men who cut everyone off report feeling calmer than they have in decades. Less anxious. Fewer arguments. More internal quiet. That doesn't mean isolation is always healthy, but it explains why some men choose it willingly. Another psychological driver that becomes stronger with age is dignity. As men get older, dignity often becomes more important than connection. Being talked down to, dismissed, or taken for granted feels intolerable. Younger men might tolerate disrespect to avoid loneliness. Older men would rather be alone than feel small. Neurologically, aging also brings changes. Emotional regulation often improves. Older adults tend to be less reactive and more selective. Senior men are not emotionally numb. They are emotionally selective. They invest only where they feel respected, understood, and at ease. Everyone else slowly fades into the background. Grief also reshapes emotional priorities. The loss of parents, siblings, friends, or spouses changes how attachment feels. After enough loss, some men become cautious with emotional investment. Distance can feel safer than disappointment. Silence can feel safer than vulnerability. It's important to understand that this behavior is rarely about hatred. More often, it's about boundaries that came too late. Many men wish they had learned earlier how to say no, how to leave, how to protect themselves emotionally. After 60, they finally apply those lessons. Sometimes abruptly, sometimes imperfectly, but almost always deliberately. And at this stage, they're no longer interested in potential. They're interested in alignment, shared values, emotional stability, mutual respect. If those things are missing, they don't wait for improvement. They disengage. This isn't cynicism. It's efficiency. As this quiet withdrawal unfolds, something unexpected often happens internally. Relief. Not happiness. Not excitement. Relief. The nervous system calms down. The constant anticipation of conflict disappears. There's no one to impress, no one to explain yourself to, no one to disappoint. For the first time in years, silence feels safe instead of lonely. And for a while, that quiet can feel deeply nourishing. Over time, that quiet begins to change shape. What first feels like relief doesn't stay exactly the same. For some men, it deepens into strength, clarity, and purpose. For others, it slowly hardens into something less visible and harder to name. This is where the psychology of cutting everyone off becomes more complex, and where the outcome depends not on the withdrawal itself, but on what replaces the noise. Many senior men report that once they step away from constant emotional demands, they begin to rediscover parts of themselves that were buried under obligation. Old interests resurface. Curiosity returns. They read more. They walk more. They think more. Without constant reaction to other people's needs or moods, their internal voice grows clearer. This is one reason why some older men appear calmer, more grounded, and more self-possessed after withdrawing. They are no longer living in reaction mode. But there is another side that rarely gets discussed. Human beings are wired for connection, even those who value solitude. When isolation is chosen consciously, it can be healthy. When it becomes permanent avoidance, it can quietly erode emotional flexibility. Some men become so protective of their peace that they stop allowing anyone close enough to challenge or support them. I once spoke with a former small business owner from Arizona who had cut off nearly everyone after retiring. For years, he described feeling lighter and more in control. But over time, he noticed something unsettling. His emotional range had narrowed. He wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't deeply joyful either. Life had become orderly, predictable, and emotionally flat. What he thought was peace had slowly turned into numbness. This is the hidden risk of withdrawal. Stability without connection can feel safe, but it can also become rigid. Without trusted feedback, small grievances can grow larger. Loneliness can disguise itself as independence. And silence, if held too tightly, can turn into armor. This is why the healthiest senior men don't cut everyone off. They cut off the wrong people. They keep one or two meaningful connections that offer honesty, warmth, and mutual respect. These connections don't drain them. They don't require performance or emotional negotiation. They simply exist. Women often struggle to understand this phase. Many interpret the withdrawal personally, believing they did something wrong. Others see it as emotional punishment. In reality, most senior men are not withdrawing from women specifically. They are withdrawing from emotional unpredictability. They are done navigating mixed signals, power struggles, or constant emotional testing. If a woman brings calm, respect, and consistency, many older men remain open. Slowly, cautiously, but genuinely. If she brings drama, entitlement, or instability, the door closes quietly and permanently. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-protection. Another important psychological shift after 60 is how men view conflict. Younger men often see conflict as something to solve. Senior men increasingly see conflict as something to avoid. Not because they are weak, but because they finally understand the cost. Stress affects sleep, blood pressure, heart health, and overall well-being. Older men are more aware of this connection. Cutting people off becomes a health decision as much as an emotional one. Trust also plays a major role. Many senior men have trusted deeply and paid for it emotionally. Betrayal hits harder later in life because it feels like there's less time to recover. When trust is broken after 60, many men don't rebuild it. They withdraw. This isn't revenge. It's risk management. There's also a quieter reason that's rarely acknowledged. Some senior men cut everyone off because they feel invisible. Society often stops listening to older men. Their experiences are dismissed as outdated. Their advice is ignored. Their emotions are minimized. Over time, some men stop offering themselves to a world that no longer seems interested. Silence becomes a response to invisibility. Interestingly, many of these men still crave meaningful connection, but only on very specific terms. They want depth without chaos, honesty without manipulation, companionship without control. If those conditions aren't met, they choose solitude. This selective openness is often mistaken for coldness. In reality, it is discernment sharpened by decades of experience. Pride and self-respect also intersect here. Senior men often refuse to beg for attention, affection, or understanding. If they feel unwanted, undervalued, or taken for granted, they remove themselves. Younger men might argue, chase, or negotiate. Older men walk away quietly. Family dynamics can intensify this process. Some senior men cut off adult children or relatives after years of disrespect, entitlement, or emotional neglect. This decision is rarely impulsive. It often comes after repeated boundary violations. Psychologically, this can be one of the most painful choices a man makes, but also one of the most liberating. He chooses self-respect over blood obligation. Still, isolation carries risks. Without external perspective, some men become trapped in their own narratives. Emotional rigidity can set in. Life becomes calm but colorless. This isn't peace. It's emotional starvation. The men who thrive are those who learn to balance solitude with selective connection. The most psychologically healthy outcome occurs when a man cuts off chaos but not humanity. He protects his peace without building walls so high that nothing can enter. He understands that boundaries don't require disappearance. Distance doesn't require silence. And solitude doesn't require bitterness. For women trying to understand senior men, this is the key insight. When an older man cuts everyone off, chasing him rarely works. Questioning him rarely works. Guilt never works. Respect does. Calm does. Consistency does. If he feels safe, he may slowly reopen. If he feels pressured, he disappears further. For senior men listening to this, the deeper question isn't whether cutting everyone off was right or wrong. The real question is what you are building in the quiet. Peace is powerful, but it must be lived, not just protected. Solitude can heal, but only if it's chosen consciously, not used as armor. Some of the most fulfilled senior men are those who learn this balance. They cut off disrespect. They cut off drama. But they stayed open to sincerity. They allowed companionship without surrendering self-respect. They learned that peace and connection are not opposites. They are partners. If this reflection resonates, take a moment to look inward. Are you protecting your peace or avoiding pain? Are you choosing solitude or hiding in it? Awareness is the difference between strength and stagnation. And sometimes the most courageous step isn't cutting people off. It's letting the right ones back in. Your experience matters. And whether you're walking this path now or trying to understand someone who is, know this. Withdrawal after 60 is rarely about not caring. More often, it's about finally caring enough to choose a life that feels calm, dignified, and emotionally honest. And that choice, when made with awareness, can lead not to isolation, but to a quieter, deeper kind of connection.